All right, so welcome to episode 7. We're covering what Howard Zinn, the author of People's History of the United States, called America's Other Civil War. He was referring to the struggle between labor, workers, and capitalists. And he uses the term war, and I use the term battle to describe what happens at Homestead Mills, a steel mill owned by Andrew Carnegie. I use these terms, Zinn used these terms, because sometimes it actually resembles warfare, where there are casualties, exchange of gunfire, etc. And we're talking about when Henry Clay Frick, who we have seen before, Frick is the manager of Carnegie's factories, decides he's going to crush the Amalgamated Association of Steel and Iron Workers. And he decides to close the plant. He's hired Pinkerton guards to replace the striking workers. They're traveling on barges. These are water vessels, traveling down the Monongahela River, which runs right by where the foundry is. And workers have surrounded the foundry. And they're not going to let the replacement workers, the Pinkerton guards, come in. There are 300 originally. They're put on 3 barges. They get to the foundry, and it's on July 5th, 3 a.m., 1892, 3 in the morning. They're armed with 300 pistols, 250 Winchester rifles. When they arrive, the workers have sounded a very loud alarm. By 4 in the morning, thousands of workers are on the banks, aiming to prevent those Pinkerton guards from getting on shore. There have been 3 barges. One barge saw the crowd gathered and said, "I'm not interested in having anything to do with that," the captain. The captain turns the vessel around. A second one anchors, decides he's going to stay away, not advance. Only one barge actually reaches the docks. And when they get there, as I've said, you have a large assembly. They're ready for battle. They suspect these Pinkerton guards are armed because Pinkerton guards have been involved in violence against workers before. They've got rocks, they've got sticks, they've got other things. So the Pinkerton guards try to leave the ship. They start by swinging clubs. 2 shots ring in the night. People are hit by bullets. That battle lasts 10 minutes. They get back on the ship. There's a second round of gunfire when the Pinkerton guards try to get on the dock again. That's at 8 in the night. 4 Union members die. There's a 15-hour battle. There are already bodies on the ground and people injured. At one point, actually, the striking workers gain control of a Civil War cannon that is in the vicinity, that's been put there to remember the Civil War. They aim the cannon at the barge, and it goes off, it misfires, and some of the Union members kill themselves accidentally by doing that. So this is what's going on. The battle's been going on for 15 hours. And the problem is the platform that the barge captain would have to stand on to steer the barge away is out in the open, and the captain would be open to gunfire. And so they're stuck, but they can't prevail over a much larger crowd on the shore. So at that point, a white flag goes up. The Pinkerton guards surrender. But the workers, their families, their supporters are enraged. They're furious at the death. They blame the Pinkerton guards for approaching so aggressively and heavily armed and coming in with nightsticks. So they force the guards to run a gauntlet. What that means when you run a gauntlet is you're made to run between 2 columns of people. And while you're running through those 2 lines, between those 2 lines, people kick you, they hit you, they throw you to the ground, etc. So this is going to be, they're going to be hit by the butt ends of rifles, by clubs, etc. When all is said and done, 6 workers have died that day, 17 suffering serious wounds. 1 Pinkerton guard on the barge committed suicide rather than surrender. Meanwhile, more than 200 are wounded of the Pinkerton guards, and three others or two others are going to die from gunshots. Two other Pinkerton guards. So this is a really bloody encounter that again resembles a battle. Well, Frick and Carnegie at that point resolved that no Union worker would ever work at that plant again. And so to prevent another siege, Pennsylvania Governor Robert E. Pattison dispatches the National Guard to seize the plant on July 12th. And what's poignant is when the National Guard approaches, the strikers actually think they're there to protect the workers. And they actually strike up a band, they're playing music, and immediately Pattison, or the National Guard commander, orders the workers to surrender their weapons, and he arrests some of them for treason, for insurrection. And later they're acquitted, they're found not guilty. Later some Pinkerton guards are arrested for homicide as well. They're also acquitted. By this point, the strike, in terms of just tactics and position, has swung in the favor of Carnegie. But the strikers' efforts are going to die pretty much completely on July 23rd, 1892, when this man, without any support from the Union, the strikers, etc., this man, and let me get his picture here. Sorry, where is he? He's right here, I believe. Nope. Oh, there he is. Okay, here he is. Okay, there he is. This man right here. His name is Alexander Berkman. Berkman is a Russian-born anarchist. He is the boyfriend, live-in lover of one of the most famous anarchists in the world, a woman named Emma Goldman. Berkman is a very devoted enemy of capitalism, and here's what he decides to do. He decides he's going to take command of the situation on his own. He gets into the plant, or the foundry. He gets to Frick's office. He has a pistol. He aims the pistol at Frick, who's working. The gun misfires. Frick and Berkman end up wrestling. At some point, Frick is actually shot in the neck. They continue to fight. Someone else comes into the office, gains control of Berkman, drags him off. Frick is injured. He goes back to his desk, and he resumes working. I admire that. If I get a paper cut, I want to take 3 weeks of sick leave off. He's working there with a bullet wound, and he continues working and signing documents while the doctors are removing the bullet from his neck. So he's in charge. You got to give him credit for being tough. Now, there's no connection between Berkman and the Union. But here's the sad thing. The Union's going to get blamed by the public for the murder attempt. And newspapers had been playing on the anxieties that the middle class had about radicalism and about the violence, supposed violence in unions. And so they're also, Berkman's an immigrant. That plays to the anti-immigrant politics. And so the public turns against the strike. By the way, a court is going to sentence Berkman to 21 years in prison for the attempted murder. He will not be released until 1907. He stays in the United States. He and Emma Goldman are both kicked out of the country after World War I in the first wave of anti-communist hysteria, the first Red Scare, right after World War I, 1919. They're put on a ship by the later director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and sent to the just established Soviet Union. Well, the strike continues. But in November, most of the workers have given up and they've returned to work. And the union, the Iron and Steel Workers Union, collapsed. Wages for workers fall to half the level they had been before the strike, even though Frick reimposes a 12-hour workday. The chief effect of the Battle of Homestead Mills, as I call it, is to kill unionism within the steel industry for decades. The last steelworkers union in that era folds in 1903. There's not going to be a successful attempt to organize steelworkers until 1937. And here's the key, and here's the major point I want to bring around on this, or bring home with this. Carnegie could have afforded reduced working hours, 8-hour workdays. He could have afforded substantial raises for his workers. He is making obscene profits at this point. In fact, his profits in the 1890s increased tenfold. When he sells his company to J.P. Morgan, the Wall Street investor, in 1901, it is for the equivalent of 1.4 billion with a B dollars today. So, and in fact, at one point he writes a friend, ashamed to tell you profits these days. This was not about money. It was not about the bottom line. It was about power and controlling workers and preventing them from having a voice when contracts were written. Industrial workers were not the only ones to suffer during the Gilded Age. Much of the misery in urban tenements could also be found in America's Farm Belt. And that misery will fuel what comes to be known as the Populist movement in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. They're going to be the group that comes to be known as the Populists are going to be some of the, in many ways, most successful radicals in American history. They're going to really challenge a lot of the economic received wisdom. And eventually in the 1890s, they're going to form a party, a third political party that's going to win some elections. It's going to be officially called the People's Party, but it's more commonly known as the Populist Party. Now, there are a lot of reasons for the rise of radicalism. We've talked about one, and that is, number one, government money policy. You have the government withdrawing the greenbacks from circulation, and that has a terrible impact on farm prices. When the money supply is shrunk by the government intentionally, for instance, wheat and cotton prices are going to drop 60% between 1870 and 1900. Cotton prices dropped from 15 cents a pound in 1870 to 5 cents a pound in 1900. What does that do? Well, a lot of farmers are in debt and they can't pay their mortgages, and they end up, I'm talking about white farmers. Black farmers had already been locked into sharecropping. White farmers increasingly become sharecroppers instead of landowners. And by the way, in Texas, you begin to have migration from Mexico into Texas, and Mexican Americans get caught into sharecropping in this period. So you have that issue. The government not only withdraws the greenbacks, it also begins to stop the minting of silver coins to tighten the money supply, which benefits the rich against everyone else. There's the issue of volatile weather. 1870s, when Native Americans are herded onto reservations or exterminated by the U.S. Army and white so-called settlers. This land is then basically opened up to white seizure. In the 1860s, 1870s, the weather's unusually good. Then we enter a period where there are droughts, rain, excessive rain that leads to floods, blizzards, etc. And these farmers are heavily indebted because they enter the year, they borrow against the next year's crop, and locusts, any kind of natural disaster like that, can wipe out all their profits. And then when their mortgages are not paid, they get seized by banks. And you have that happen in, like for instance, in Kansas at one point in the 1890s, half the farms have been repossessed by banks. This is a real crisis for farmers in this era. You have this incredible problem also because people get to this abundant land, what are called the Plain States, Nebraska, Kansas, modern day North and South Dakota, going into the Rocky Mountain states. They're trying to pay their debts, and so all of them grow from fence to fence, or as farmers put it, bumper to bumper, what are called bumper crops, the amount they grow. And what happens is oversupply. And because of oversupply, you have this terrible problem with prices dropping to virtually nothing. And that leads them to lose their property also. So this leads to the rise of several groups, radical farmer groups. We'll primarily refer to this one first group that rises in the 1870s as the Grangers. Their full name of the group is the National Grange of the Orders of the Patrons of Husbandry. Let's just call them the Grangers. They love prepositions. Prepositions. That's formed in 1867. This group is, as they say today, is going to grow viral. Maybe we don't want to use that term anymore, given news lately, but this group is going to grow exponentially. It's going to have 1.5 million members, primarily in the plain states of Kansas and Nebraska, what becomes the state of Oklahoma. It's Indian territory at that point, and in the old Confederacy. They're going to take two approaches to try to solve farmers' problems. Problem of debt and the problem of overproduction, and a third problem I haven't mentioned. And that's the problem, and I'll write it down here, of what are in that era called middlemen. Middlemen are all the businesses, the people running the businesses that are between the farmer and the customer. So the trains that transport the grains, the cattle, the sheep, those businesses, the warehouses that store the crops that farmers grow, and so on. These businesses are overcharging farmers to a ridiculous degree. And to give you an example, so for instance, these warehouses, these farming warehouses, they're not owned by farmers, they're owned by big businessmen. Get a big discount when they transport crops. Farmers don't. So if we talk about North and South Dakota, and compare it to a farmer transporting his goods from North to South Dakota to a warehouse transporting crops from South Dakota to London. The farmer transporting his crops from North to South Dakota is going to get charged more than a warehouse owner transporting crops from the middle of the country, from the west, from South Dakota all the way to New York, across the Atlantic to London. That's how badly farmers are being overcharged. So there are several problems that farmers face. The Grangers have two main approaches to solve these issues. They're going to lobby state legislatures, for instance in Wisconsin and Illinois, to pass laws that regulate how much railroads can charge farmers for transporting goods, and they're going to prohibit price-fixing conspiracies. What's a price-fixing conspiracy? That's when businesses are supposed to be competing, basically say, we'll charge, like railroad companies say, we'll charge these farmers the same high rate, so both of us, both of our companies make a killing. We both overcharge, we both make huge profits, we won't undercut each other. They get state legislatures to pass those laws. Then, so that's one law. The other law is, or the other approach is going to be farmers forming cooperatives. We'll get to that in a second. The laws I mentioned are called Granger laws. However, the U.S. Supreme Court will hear a challenge to the Granger laws brought by the railroad companies, brought by the warehouse owners, and they're going to say that those laws violate those corporations' 14th Amendment rights. We talked about that earlier in the semester. 14th Amendment is passed during Reconstruction. It's meant to protect freedmen at that point, but instead, corporations are deemed legally persons in that era. And the 14th Amendment says you can't be denied property without due process. The courts are going to say laws like that are a denial of due process. These corporate persons have a right to profit. If the farmers want to end overcharging, they should sue. We know why that's not going to be a fair fight. So those laws are overturned, the Granger laws. Secondly, the Grangers are going to try to form their own warehouses, their own country stores, their own grain elevators, their own companies, and they're going to form cooperatives that are kind of like a Sam's Club on a grand scale, or a Costco. But it's for farmers who belong. They pay a membership fee, and then they can buy things at these cooperatives. They can store their crops for a very low cost, just basically to cover operating expenses. However, there's a problem. They can't get loans from big business to get these enterprises off the ground. Secondly, they try to do these cooperatives, try to establish them during a depression, 1873 to 1878, that kills off the cooperatives. So, all this causes the Granger membership, when the cooperatives fail and the Granger laws are overturned, to drop by 2/3 by the time you get to the end of the 1870s. However, they've established a precedent for the next wave of farmer protest, which is the formation of these three groups in the 1880s. The Grangers are in the 1870s. These groups, these alliances, are formed in the 1880s. There are three big alliances: the Northwestern Farmers Alliance, the Southern Farmers Alliance, and the Colored Farmers Alliance, as it was known. Now, the Northwestern Alliance covers states that had been Union states during the Civil War that are in the Farm Belt, west of the Mississippi River, heading up to Canada. So Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Minnesota, etc. The Southern Farmers Alliance is going to be made up of farmers in the old Confederate states. And the Colored Farmers Alliance are Southern African American farmers, okay? So these are going to be the three groups, the alliances, and these groups are going to be gigantic. The most radical politically, and one that's eventually going to call for some ideas that are frankly socialist, is going to be the Southern Farmers Alliance. By the way, these are white farmers. These are black farmers. They're in separate organizations, but here's what's important. They are, in a sense, segregated, but they're allies. They're fighting for the same cause, and they work together. And in fact, members of the Southern Farmers Alliance are going to criticize the use of race to divide farmers against each other. This is truly a revolutionary organization. By 1890, the Southern Farmers Alliance claims more than 3 million members. They reach across the color line, as I said, and they help recruit African Americans into the Colored Farmers Alliance, which, by the way, at its peak, has 250,000 members. So they're going to borrow some ideas from the Grangers. They're going to form their own cooperatives. They call them exchanges. These are these cooperatives, where they start their own country stores, their own warehouses, etc. And they're going to have a similar problem. There's going to be a depression, once again, in the middle of the 1880s. They're going to have trouble getting loans from businesses that can get these exchanges started. That's a problem. Also, they try to get the Democrats and Republicans to pass laws to address the exploitation of the railroad companies and other big businesses. They're not successful. This will shock you, but the Democrats and the Republicans agree on a lot of issues at that time. Anyway, that's it for today. We'll go to episode 8 next time. See you then.